Each case reinforced the others like overlapping fields of fire. Even if Victoria somehow won one battle, the other four would crush her. And thanks to something Sarah called the private attorney general doctrine, we could recover all legal costs if we won. Environmental law actually encourages citizens to sue violators when government agencies can't keep up with enforcement. The financial investigation had grown into something beautiful and terrifying. Jennifer had recruited 3 more law students and a forensic accounting professor who treated HOA fraud like a particularly interesting puzzle. They discovered that Victoria's pattern of inflated contracts extended back 4 years, involving landscaping security systems and legal consulting fees that all traced back to her business network. Total estimated embezzlement, over $250,000 from homeowner assessments. That wasn't just civil fraud, it was federal racketeering territory, with prison sentences measured in years rather than months. Meanwhile, I was designing the creek restoration using great-uncle's original surveys and modern environmental engineering standards. The natural channel design would prevent flooding while restoring fish habitat at a total cost of about $45,000, less than 1/3 what Victoria had wasted. On her concrete disaster, Montana Trout Unlimited had committed $30,000 to the restoration fund. The Sierra Club added another $20,000. Local fishing clubs, environmental groups, and even some guilty HOA members were contributing to what we'd started calling the Silver Creek Redemption Project. The community organizing had taken on a life of its own. Weekly meetings in my garage drew 40 or 50 people, including veterans who appreciated seeing a field engineer's great-nephew fight bureaucratic stupidity. Rebecca handled the social media campaign. Save Silver Creek had over 7,000 followers and growing. Dr. Maria Rodriguez from Montana State's Environmental Engineering Department had volunteered to serve as our expert witness. She'd reviewed Great Uncle's 1976 predictions and confirmed them with modern computer modeling. The concrete channel would increase flood risk by 450% during heavy spring runoff, directing all that water straight toward the HOA home's foundations. Your great-uncle was 55 years ahead of his time, she told me, studying his hand-drawn flowcharts. This is exactly how we design natural flood control today. Victoria didn't just destroy a creek, she eliminated a sophisticated engineering system that had been protecting the whole valley. The media strategy was coordinated through Sarah's office. Local reporters loved the David versus Goliath angle, but we were being careful to focus on environmental protection rather than personal revenge. The story was spreading beyond Montana. Environmental law blogs, fishing magazines, even a documentary crew from Montana Public Television. But the secret weapon was still Great-Uncle's historical evidence. His 1950s photographs showed exactly how the natural creek had handled spring floods for decades without causing any property damage. Those images would be devastating visual evidence in court, proving that concrete created the flood risk rather than preventing it. Weather Service predictions were confirming our worst-case scenarios: heavy snowpack in the Rockies, warmer than normal spring temperatures, and multiple storm systems headed our way during peak snowmelt season. The concrete channel was going to face its first real test, and it was going to fail spectacularly. Harold Kowalski had become our inside intelligence source, reporting on increasingly desperate HOA board meetings where remaining members were starting to panic about legal liability. 4 board members had already resigned, claiming they'd been misled about the project's legality. The timeline was accelerating, faster than spring snowmelt. Federal EPA investigation formally opened county. DA announced criminal investigation into HOA financial. Management state environmental. Agency issued emergency cease and desist orders. Multiple class action. Lawsuits filed by other HOA victims across Montana. Rebecca and I spent our evenings walking the concrete-destroyed creek, planning its resurrection. The sound of water fighting against artificial constraints, the smell of concrete curing in mountain air. It was ugly but temporary. How long until we can bring it back to life? She asked. I calculated seasonal flooding, legal timelines, and construction schedules. By next spring, this creek will be more beautiful than Great-Uncle ever imagined. Assuming we survive this spring first. Desperation has a particular smell. Part lavender air freshener, part fierce sweat, and part the acrid burn of bridges being torched by someone too stubborn to admit defeat. That's what filled Victoria's real estate office at 7:15 a.m. on April 5th, when she called me for an emergency meeting that felt more like a hostage negotiation. "Robert," she said, sliding another envelope across her glass desk, "I've been thinking about our situation. Maybe we can find a mutually beneficial solution." The envelope contained a cashier's check for $850,000 and a non-disclosure agreement that would have made the CIA proud. "Take the money, relocate outside Montana, transfer my water rights to a conservation trust managed by the HOA, and never speak publicly about creek restoration, environmental law, or HOA governance." The threat was barely disguised. "Legal battles destroy families, Robert. Ask Rebecca how her teaching career would survive if the school board heard about her husband's radical environmental activism." I'd brought my digital recorder again, perfectly legal in Montana. And Victoria's next words were prosecutorial gold. "If you don't take this final offer, I'll personally ensure that every contractor, every supplier, every business owner in this valley knows you're a troublemaker who costs people money. Your wife's tutoring business, your automotive hobby, your reputation, all of it can disappear. I have connections you can't imagine. That same night, my garage got hit again. This time they weren't just stealing, they were sending a message. My completed Challenger was tipped over. Frame bent, 50 hours of restoration work destroyed in minutes. Great-uncle's original engineering journals were scattered across the floor, some pages torn, others soaked with motor oil. But they'd made a crucial mistake. The upgraded security system I'd installed after the first break-in captured everything in high-definition color. 3 figures in hoodies systematically vandalizing my property, followed by a white BMW with distinctive vanity plates, picking them up at 2:45 a.m. One of the vandals was wearing $400 sneakers that matched a pair I'd seen on Victoria's 19-year-old son. The psychological warfare escalated into something that belonged in a corporate thriller. Anonymous reviews bombed Rebecca's tutoring business. Unprofessional conduct, political indoctrination, unsafe environment for children. Someone created fake social media accounts spreading lies about my military service, claiming I'd been dishonorably discharged for mental instability and violent tendencies toward authority figures. The school principal called Rebecca in for a concerned conversation about complaints regarding her husband's increasingly erratic behavior. 5 parents canceled tutoring sessions after receiving anonymous letters warning them about dangerous political extremists in the education system. But here's what Victoria fundamentally misunderstood about engineers. We document everything. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous complaint went into a file system that would have impressed federal investigators because that's exactly what they'd become. Agent Rebecca Park from the FBI's white-collar crime unit had opened a formal investigation into the HOA financial fraud. Agent Carlos Rodriguez from the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division was building a case around the environmental violations. Jennifer Martinez's forensic accounting had provided them with a roadmap to nearly $250,000 in embezzled homeowner funds. The pressure was showing in Victoria's increasingly erratic behavior. Harold Kowalski reported that she'd had screaming matches with 4 board members during their last meeting, accusing them of betraying the community vision by questioning legal expenses. 3 more board members resigned, leaving only Victoria and 1 loyal ally managing a subdivision in full legal meltdown. Meanwhile, spring snowmelt was accelerating faster than normal. April temperatures were running 18 degrees and above average, and the National Weather Service had issued flood watches for the entire region. Silver Creek was already running at 175% of normal seasonal flow, and peak snowmelt was still 5 weeks away. I spent my evenings taking flow measurements, documenting how the concrete channel was handling increased water volume. The results were exactly what Great Uncle's engineering had predicted. Instead of spreading excess water across the natural floodplain, the concrete was concentrating 100% of the flow into a narrow, high-pressure stream aimed directly at the HOA homes. Dr. Rodriguez from Montana State had run computer simulations showing that during peak flood conditions, water velocity in the concrete channel would reach levels capable of undermining foundation stability. Insurance companies were already asking questions about unauthorized modifications to natural drainage patterns, modifications that could void flood coverage entirely. Monday morning, I filed my own complaint with the county. Not merely a defense, a counteroffensive. I demanded that Victoria's group pay for a proper environmental assessment, since their legal harassment was based on fraudulent information. Attached Frank's analysis showing how their precious development actually increased flood risk for everyone downstream. The county water commissioner, a gentleman named Rodriguez, who'd been handling water disputes since before Victoria discovered Montana existed, examined my documentation and began laughing. "Mr. Patterson," he said, "these people just attempted to lecture a hydrologist about water flow using charts from the Nixon administration. This might be the briefest water rights case in state history." 3 weeks later, complete vindication. The county sided with me on every point, ordered the HOA to cease all water-related harassment, and officially validated my historical water rights. Suddenly, my claims weren't just grandfathered. They were etched in legal granite. But victory brought interesting consequences. The local newspaper ran the story. HOA challenges century-old water rights, loses spectacularly. Neighbors I'd never encountered started appearing at my garage door with their own Victoria horror stories, violations for non-conforming mailboxes, fines for unauthorized garden decorations, threats about inappropriate exterior paint colors. That evening, Rebecca found me by the creek at sunset. Great-uncle's fishing rod in my hands, but no intention of actually fishing. "This is where he taught me about water," I told her. "How it always finds the simplest path but never stops flowing toward where it belongs." "And where does this particular water belong?" she asked. I smiled, listening to Silver Creek babble over stones that preceded Victoria's bloodline by several geological epochs. Right through the center of her perfect little kingdom. You'd think losing a water rights case would teach someone humility. You'd be wrong. Victoria Sterling had apparently graduated from the school of doubling down on terrible ideas because her next move was so audacious. It actually impressed me, in a horrifying watching someone jump off a cliff while screaming about their constitutional right to fly kind of way. 4 weeks after the county told her to back off, Victoria called an emergency HOA board meeting. Naturally, she scheduled it during the 1 week Rebecca and I had planned a trip to visit Amanda in Seattle, our first real vacation since this entire mess started. The meeting notice got sent to our previous address from 3 moves ago, ensuring we couldn't object to whatever fresh insanity she was concocting. The agenda item looked harmless enough. Emergency Flood Mitigation Assessment. What actually happened was Victoria presenting doctored photographs showing severe erosion damage to HOA property. Pictures that looked suspiciously like they'd been taken after she'd hired someone to excavate holes near the creek with a bulldozer. She claimed her engineering consultant, a guy who turned out to be her brother-in-law's landscaping contractor, had determined that immediate concrete channeling was needed to prevent catastrophic property damage. The vote passed 7-1 with only Harold Kowalski objecting. Harold called me in Seattle that night, his Polish accent thick with disgust. "Robert, this woman is an insane person. She says flood will destroy everything if we don't put concrete in your creek. She has pictures, but something smells like fish that sits in sun too long. Special assessment, $2,100 per homeowner for emergency flood control infrastructure. Total project cost, $142,000 for what any actual engineer could have told them was completely unnecessary." But Victoria had found her golden hammer, and suddenly every problem looked like a nail requiring concrete. I cut our vacation short and drove home through the night, Rebecca sleeping restlessly in the passenger seat, while I white-knuckled the steering wheel and calculated how much damage they could inflict in 72 hours. The answer, as it turned out, was substantial. The sound struck me first. Jackhammers and diesel engines roaring where morning birdsongs used to live. Then the smell. Concrete dust mixing with destroyed vegetation. Diesel exhaust hanging in the valley like industrial smog. I rounded the corner to my driveway and saw what Victoria had done to 160 years of natural beauty. My creek was gone. In its place, an ugly concrete trough that resembled a prison drainage ditch. Clear mountain water that used to dance over smooth stones now flowed through a 20-inch deep gray channel that belonged in an urban wasteland, not the Montana mountains. They'd buried Great-uncle's carefully positioned boulders under tons of concrete, destroying fish-spawning areas that had existed since before Montana was a state. Rebecca stood beside me, tears streaming down her face. "They murdered it," she whispered. "They actually murdered a living creek. But here's the thing about being a hydrologist who spent 3 decades dealing with environmental regulations. You learn to think like water. And water always finds the truth eventually. I spent the next week documenting everything, photographs from every angle, water flow measurements, samples for chemical analysis. More importantly, I researched Summit Construction, the company that had done the work. Turns out they had quite the track record. 4 EPA violations in 6 years, $85,000 in fines for unauthorized waterway modifications, and a pattern of starting work before permits were approved. Because here's something every property owner should understand. Any significant modification to a natural waterway requires approval from the county, the state environmental agency, and often the EPA. It's like a legal 3-layer cake, and you need permission for every layer. Victoria's crew had skipped all 3. The Clean Water Act doesn't mess around when it comes to unauthorized concrete and fish habitat. I'd seen cases where violators faced $35,000 per day in fines, and that was just the federal level. Montana's Environmental Protection Agency could add another $15,000 daily. The math was simple. Every day that concrete stayed in place was another $50,000 in potential fines. I filed complaints with every agency that had jurisdiction: County Code Enforcement, State Environmental Protection, and the EPA's Region 8 office in Denver. Then I called the local Trout Unlimited chapter, whose president nearly suffered a stroke when I described what they'd done to the spawning areas. "Mr. Patterson," he said, "this is exactly the kind of habitat destruction we've been fighting for 25 years. We'll provide whatever support you need, legal, financial, technical witnesses. These people just declared war on every fish in Montana." The counterattack was swift and comprehensive. Within 12 days, I had 4 separate government agencies investigating, an environmental law clinic from the University of Montana, offering free legal representation, and enough documentation to bury Blackstone and Partners in their own paperwork. But Victoria wasn't finished. Harold Kowalski warned me she was already planning the next escalation. A full flood control system that would concrete the entire creek from the county road to the subdivision boundary. Her reasoning: if we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. That night, I sat in my garage surrounded by great-uncle's engineering journals, studying his 1950s photographs of the natural creek system. The old field engineer had designed something beautiful that worked for 75 years without a single flood incident. Victoria had destroyed it in 4 days, but she'd also just handed me enough federal violations to put her in prison. If you've ever wondered what desperation smells like, it's lavender candles mixed with fear sweat in a real estate office at 7:30 a.m. That's where I found myself 4 weeks later, sitting across from Victoria Sterling as she tried to convince me that black was white and concrete was natural. "Robert," she said, sliding a manila envelope across her glass desk, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. This whole situation has been unfortunate. Inside the envelope, a cashier's check for $600,000 and a non-disclosure agreement thicker than my great-uncle's engineering manual. The offer was simple and illegal as hell. Take the money, agree never to discuss the creek situation publicly, and relocate outside the county within 8 months. Oh, and sign over my water rights to the HOA for proper management." The threat was barely veiled. Legal battles are expensive, Robert. Even when you win, you lose. Think about Rebecca's job security. I'd brought a small digital recorder, perfectly legal in Montana with single-party consent, and Victoria's next words were pure gold. "If you don't take this offer, I'll make sure every property owner in this valley knows you're an anti-development extremist who's trying to destroy property values. My real estate connections run deep, and your wife's teaching career could become complicated." That same week, my garage got vandalized again. This time, they weren't subtle about it. Classic car parts scattered across the floor, tools stolen, and my restored 1969 Challenger tipped over with sugar poured in the gas tank. But they'd made a mistake. The new security cameras I'd installed caught everything, including a clear shot of a white BMW parked at the end of my driveway at 2:30 a.m. The psychological warfare escalated daily. Anonymous online reviews started appearing for Rebecca's after-school tutoring business. Unprofessional political agenda. Don't trust your children with radicals. Someone called her principal with concerns about her fitness to teach. The stress was eating at both of us. Rebecca losing sleep, me checking my blood pressure twice a day. Imagine waking up to the thunderous rumble of cement trucks obliterating a pristine stream that has meandered behind your house since the days of westward expansion. The acrid smell of diesel fumes mingles with pulverized limestone as you witness $95,000 of neighborhood fees being dumped into what was once a crystal-clear mountain waterway. It's essential flood prevention, declares HOA chairwoman Victoria Sterling from behind the wheel of her pristine white BMW. What this property developer failed to realize? I'm a former Army Corps hydraulic engineer, and she just constructed a disaster waiting to happen. Fast forward 8 months. Victoria's $1.3 million mansion sits submerged in 3 feet of stagnant floodwater, its foundation fracturing, while my modest property remains perfectly dry. Federal agents are at her doorstep, and that concrete conduit she championed is about to cost her everything. What would you do if your homeowners association misappropriated your funds to devastate your sanctuary? Where are you watching this unfold from? I'm certain your neighbors have attempted something equally outrageous. My name is Robert Patterson, 61 years old, and until 8 months ago I believed the greatest threat to my peace of mind was locating transmission parts for a 1969 Dodge Challenger. I was mistaken. The real danger was an HOA chairwoman who mistook a property development certificate for a doctorate in hydraulic engineering. I inherited my great-uncle's 3-acre haven in what was formerly agricultural Montana, back when Pine Ridge was nothing but wheat fields and the only HOA meant herd of Aberdeen cattle. My great-uncle, Thomas Patterson, was a field engineer who survived the Battle of the Bulge and returned home to create something magnificent. This stream was his meditation. Every dawn for 4 years since retiring from the Corps of Engineers, I'd perform the same morning ritual. Coffee on the front deck, listening to Silver Creek murmur over polished river rocks, the aroma of motor oil from my garage mixing with damp pine bark, the sound of metalwork echoing across pristine water at sunrise. My work boots treading on stone pathways great-uncle laid by hand in 1951. Rebecca, my wife of 29 years, teaches 5th grade and possesses the forbearance of a sage, which she would require for the coming storm. Our children dispersed like prairie grass. Amanda is preserving lives as an emergency room physician in Seattle. David is troubleshooting software in Denver. Both inherited great-uncle's determined nature. What made our land remarkable wasn't the 1960s farmhouse or my cluttered garage filled with classic car components. It was 500 yards of creek with water privileges dating to 1869, predating Montana statehood, predating electric power, and certainly predating suburban royalty with superiority complexes. Then came Pine Ridge Manor, multiplying around us like costly weeds after rainfall. 52 houses. Average cost $1.1 million. Primarily Texas refugees escaping their own HOA catastrophes. The irony was denser than dawn fog over the creek. Enter our antagonist Victoria Sterling, 49, HOA board chairwoman and self-declared sovereign of suburban excellence. Recently arrived from Harris County with that distinctive combination of privilege and ignorance that only emerges from peddling overvalued properties to frantic buyers. White BMW, personalized plates reading "Sold for You," and those diamond studs she displayed like military decorations. Her spouse operates some hedge fund with downtown commutes. Their children attend exclusive academies where they presumably learned that people like me are financially challenged rather than having chosen different values. Their $1.3 million Tudor mansion borders directly on my creek, manicured landscape terminating where authentic wilderness begins. The opening assault came on a Wednesday morning that smelled of fresh brew and approaching legal expenses. Official HOA violation notice registered delivery. Unsightly accumulation of automotive components visible from adjacent properties violates community appearance standards. Penalty $250 per day until compliance achieved. I studied it carefully. The legal ridiculousness penetrating like creek water into parched earth. Here's what Victoria's costly attorneys overlooked. My property preceded their HOA by 85 years. Great-uncle's title included mineral privileges, water privileges, and a grandfathered exemption from future development restrictions. But they were gambling. This old mechanic wouldn't understand fundamental property statutes. The personal confrontation proceeded exactly as anticipated. Victoria's office reeking of lavender candles and arrogance, she proposed with that rehearsed grin, Property developers master in expensive mirrors that I might find greater happiness somewhere with more accommodating property regulations. Translation: somewhere working-class people belong. I replied with a registered letter clarifying that HOA restrictions don't govern grandfathered properties. Elementary real estate law. Primary lesson when dealing with water privileges and access rights. Her retaliation was immediate and costly. Anonymous reports to the county regarding illegal commercial activities, because apparently restoring automobiles appears suspicious to people who hire others to replace their air filters. Building inspector examined my garage for 3 hours, discovered nothing improper except my filing system. Still cost me $400 in attorney fees, demonstrating I wasn't operating a stolen parts operation. But that was merely Victoria testing the boundaries, literally and metaphorically. The genuine madness commenced when she realized my water privileges were complex. In Montana, water means authority, and in Victoria's universe, people like me with rough hands and grandfathered land don't merit either. That's when I understood this wasn't about car parts. This was warfare. Spring snowmelt ran heavy that season, and Silver Creek sang louder than usual as it rushed over the Beaver Dam 120 yards upstream. The sound of rapid water over granite mixed with the scent of wet pine bark and morning vapor rising from the surface. It should have been tranquil. Instead, it became the soundtrack to Victoria's next brilliant legal strategy. She'd completed her research this time, or believed she had, hiring Blackstone and Partners, a Billings law firm specializing in what they diplomatically termed environmental property conflicts, which translates to creative methods for harassing neighbors using government regulations. Their approach was sophisticated in its cruelty. File a nuisance water flow complaint with the county, alleging my property generated hazardous runoff, threatening those precious $1 million homes downstream. The legal documents arrived on a Friday morning, thick as a Billings phone directory and equally helpful. 63 pages of technical language essentially stating, "Force the old man to prove his 160-year-old creek won't flood our clients' mansions." They wanted to compel me into a $65,000 environmental impact assessment. You know, the type requiring 2 years and hiring the same consultants who probably play tennis with their lawyers on weekends. Rebecca found me that evening standing waist-deep in creek water, my boots sinking in muddy banks while I examined flow patterns with great-uncle's old surveyor's level. "What are you considering?" she asked, using that elementary school teacher tone, meaning she could detect trouble brewing. "I'm thinking Victoria's expensive lawyers just made a $65,000 error," I said, watching water swirl around a boulder great-uncle had positioned manually in 1956. "And I'm thinking they selected the wrong retired engineer to antagonize. See? Here's something I learned during 32 years with the Army Corps. Lawyers favor complicated-sounding environmental regulations because they assume ordinary people won't comprehend them. What they forget is that some of us actually designed the systems they're attempting to regulate. It's like watching someone explain how your own motorcycle engine operates to you, the person who assembled it. I contacted my former colleague Frank Morrison at the Montana Water Authority. Took him precisely 12 minutes to identify what Blackstone and Partners had missed. They'd based their entire legal complaint on watershed charts from 1971. Before the highway was constructed, before half the subdivisions upstream existed, before modern storm drainage systems altered every flow pattern in the region. "Robert," Frank chuckled over the phone, "these charts show creek behavior that hasn't existed since Carter was president. You want me to forward the current surveys? This will be humiliating for them." The modern geological data revealed a completely different narrative. Far from creating problems, my section of creek actually prevented flooding by providing natural retention during spring runoff. Those granite boulders great-uncle positioned weren't merely aesthetic. The old field engineer had constructed a flood control system before most people knew the term existed. But here's where it became truly fascinating. Back in engineering school, they taught us about something called prior appropriation doctrine. Essentially, Montana water law operates on the principle of first come, first served. Since my family had documented water usage dating to 1869, our rights superseded anything filed afterward, including Victoria's entire subdivision, her HOA, and probably her great-grandchildren's future complaints. I spent that weekend in my garage, surrounded by great-uncle's engineering journals and current county survey charts, connecting details that Victoria's lawyers had completely overlooked. The familiar scent of motor oil mixed with old paper, The scratch of pencil on graph paper. It felt like channeling the old man's spirit. And perhaps I was. But here's what Victoria didn't understand about engineers. We're methodical. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every anonymous complaint got documented with the precision of a federal investigation, because that's exactly what it was becoming. The EPA had opened a formal case file. The Montana Attorney General's office sent investigators. Local environmental groups were treating this like the Exxon Valdez of suburban creek destruction, and I was gathering allies faster than Victoria was making enemies. Jennifer Martinez, a third-year environmental law student at the University of Montana, had taken my case as her senior thesis project. She discovered something interesting while digging through HOA financial records. A pattern of inflated contracts with companies that had mysterious connections to Victoria's real estate network. "Mr. Patterson," she said, spreading documents across my garage table, "this concrete project cost $142,000 for work that should have been $55,000 maximum. The excess went to consulting fees and emergency contractor premiums that all trace back to companies owned by Victoria's business associates. The girl had found smoking guns where I'd only suspected smoke. Board meetings held in secret, contracts approved without competitive bidding, special assessments used to fund personal vendettas. What started as environmental destruction was looking more like organized fraud. But the real revelation came from great-uncle's engineering journals. While researching the original creek design, I'd found his 1976 consulting report for the county, a document that predicted exactly what was happening now. He'd warned against concrete channeling in this specific location, calculating that it would increase downstream flooding risk by 350% during spring runoff. The report included detailed flow charts, seasonal water tables, and soil absorption rates, everything Victoria's engineering consultant had ignored. More importantly, it proved that someone with actual engineering credentials had already studied this problem 55 years ago and reached the opposite conclusion from Victoria's landscaper. That's when I realized the beautiful irony of the situation. Victoria thought she was solving a flooding problem, but she'd actually created a hydraulic time bomb. Spring snowmelt was 8 weeks away, and the concrete channel was going to direct every drop of water straight toward the HOA home's foundations. The natural creek had meandered through my property, distributing flow across a wide floodplain that absorbed excess water like a sponge. The concrete channel eliminated that natural absorption, creating a high-pressure water cannon aimed directly at million-dollar basements. I spent that weekend with my calculator, great-uncle's flow charts, and current weather predictions. The math was terrifying and beautiful. When the spring floods hit, and they would hit hard that year, Victoria's concrete solution would turn a manageable water flow into a foundation-destroying torrent. My property, being upstream and naturally elevated, would stay bone dry. The HOA homes sitting downstream from the concrete channel were going to flood like a submarine with screen doors. Harold Kowalski stopped by that Sunday evening, finding me sketching restoration plans at my kitchen table. "Robert," he said, "this woman Victoria, she is making big mistake." Yes. I looked at the Weather Service predictions showing heavy snowpack and wet spring ahead, then at great-uncle's engineering calculations proving exactly what would happen when physics met stupidity. "Harold," I said, "she just built the world's most expensive lawsuit. The creek is going to have its revenge with compound interest." Jennifer Martinez arrived at my garage on a gray March morning with a banker's box full of documents and the kind of expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Not me, thankfully. Mr. Patterson," she said, setting the box on my workbench with a satisfying thump. "I think you're going to want to sit down for this." For 4 weeks, Jennifer had been conducting what she called forensic accounting on the HOA's financial records, basically following the money trail like a bloodhound with a CPA license. What she'd found would have made the FBI's white-collar crime unit weep with joy. The concrete project that cost homeowners $142,000. The actual work was worth maybe $55,000. The remaining $87,000 had disappeared into a maze of consulting fees, emergency contractor premiums, and environmental assessment costs that all led back to companies with suspiciously familiar names. Sterling Property Consulting, Pine Ridge Environmental Solutions. Victoria wasn't just destroying my creek. She was robbing her own neighbors blind while doing it, but that was just the appetizer. The main course came when Harold Kowalski shuffled into my garage 25 minutes later, clutching a small digital recorder like it contained the secrets of the universe. Which, in a way, it did. "Robert," he said, his Polish accent thick with righteous anger. "You remember I told you I voted against Concrete Project? I maybe forgot to mention I recorded whole meeting. The recording was devastating, Victoria's voice clear as mountain water, explaining to the board that the real goal wasn't flood control, it was driving out incompatible residents who don't understand our community vision. She'd explicitly discussed using HOA funds to force me into expensive legal battles, knowing most people couldn't afford to fight back. The best part, her admission that the Concrete Project wasn't about preventing floods. It was about eliminating anything that made the neighborhood look rural or working class. She wanted to remove every trace of the area's ranching heritage to boost property values for her real estate business. But the real bombshell was buried in Great-Uncle's engineering files. While organizing his papers for the legal case, I'd found a folder marked Pine Ridge Development Consultation 1976. Inside, a complete hydrological analysis he'd done for the county, warning against any concrete channeling in this exact location. His calculations were precise and prophetic. Concrete channeling would eliminate the natural flood absorption capacity of the creek bed, directing 100% of spring runoff toward the downstream development area. During heavy snowmelt years like this one, the result would be catastrophic foundation flooding for any homes built in the natural flood plain, which was exactly where Victoria's house sat. The engineering report included detailed topographical maps showing that my property was naturally elevated above the flood zone while the HOA development occupied the traditional overflow area. Great-Uncle had actually recommended against building there, but developers in the 1990s had ignored his warnings. Reading his meticulous notes felt like receiving a message from the grave. The creek will reclaim its flood plain eventually. Concrete will only make it angry when it does. Jennifer spread the financial evidence across my workbench while I laid out Great-Uncle's engineering predictions. The pattern was clear. Victoria had embezzled nearly $87,000 from her neighbors to build a flood creation device that would destroy their homes while keeping mine safe. This is conspiracy, fraud, environmental destruction, and possibly racketeering, Jennifer said, organizing documents into neat legal piles. The EPA violations alone could put her in federal prison. Add in the financial crimes and she's looking at serious time. Rebecca joined us for coffee, studying the evidence with her teacher's eye for patterns. She played herself, she said quietly. Every move she made to hurt us actually created more evidence against her. Outside, March snow was melting faster than usual, and Silver Creek was starting to run high in its concrete prison. Weather Service predictions called for the heaviest spring runoff in 25 years. Victoria had built herself a ticking time bomb and handed me the evidence to convict her when it exploded. The only question now was whether I should warn her neighbors what was coming or let physics teach the lesson. Great-Uncle's engineering had predicted 55 years ago. My garage had transformed from an automobile restoration shop into something that looked like a war room, designed by engineers who'd watched too many spy movies. Every surface was covered with maps, legal documents, financial records, and Great-Uncle's engineering drawings. The coffee pot ran constantly, the landline never stopped ringing, and Rebecca had started bringing sandwich platters for the steady stream of allies showing up at our door. The restoration of my 1969 Dodge Challenger sat in the corner, finally completed, a symbol of bringing dead things back to life, which seemed appropriate considering what we were planning for the creek. Sarah Morrison, the environmental lawyer from the University of Montana Legal Clinic, had officially taken my case pro bono after seeing Jennifer's financial evidence. Sarah was the kind of attorney who'd rather fight polluters than chase ambulances, and she approached environmental law like a chess grandmaster with a grudge. "Robert," she said, spreading out a timeline across my workbench, "we're not just fighting one case here. We're fighting 5 separate legal battles simultaneously, and we're going to win them all." The strategy was elegant in its complexity. Federal case, clean water. Act violations and unauthorized habitat destruction state case. Water rights infringement and environmental permit fraud county case. Building code violations and improper special assessments. Civil case. Fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Criminal case, embezzlement and witness intimidation. The community support had grown beyond anything I'd expected. Local businesses displayed Support Robert signs. The high school environmental club adopted creek restoration as their senior project. Veterans organizations were treating this like an attack on one of their own. Regional fishing and environmental groups had turned my case into a symbol of grassroots resistance against corporate-style HOA tyranny. But Victoria wasn't finished escalating. Harold warned me she was planning something. Desperate for the next board meeting, possibly hiring private security to protect HOA assets or attempting to get a restraining order claiming I was dangerous to community safety. That night, Rebecca found me in the garage studying weather predictions and great-uncle's flood calculations by lamplight. "How bad is it going to be?" she asked. I looked at the snowpack reports, the concrete channel flow rates, and the topographical maps showing exactly where all that pressurized water was headed. "Bad enough to end this permanently," I said. "One way or another." The phone call came at 5:45 a.m. on April 18th, jolting me awake with the particular urgency that meant someone's world was about to end. It was Harold Kowalski, whispering like he was conducting espionage from his kitchen. "Robert, you need to know. Victoria, she is packing moving truck. Big one, middle of night, very suspicious behavior." I threw on clothes and drove past Victoria's house just as the sun was painting the mountains gold. Sure enough, a commercial moving truck sat in her driveway while she supervised the loading of expensive furniture, her BMW already packed with personal items. The woman who'd spent 8 months trying to drive me out of the valley was apparently planning her own strategic retreat. But not before one final desperate gambit that was either brilliant or completely insane, probably both. Jennifer Martinez called an hour later with news that made my coffee taste like battery acid. "Mr. Patterson, Victoria just filed for an emergency restraining order claiming you've been stalking her family and making terrorist threats against HOA property. She's asking for federal protection under anti-domestic terrorism statutes." The legal papers were a masterpiece of creative fiction. According to Victoria's sworn affidavit, I was a disgruntled military veteran with documented anger management issues who had been conducting surveillance of HOA families and threatening to sabotage community infrastructure. She'd even included photographs of me taking water flow measurements as evidence of suspicious reconnaissance activity. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the same day as peak spring snowmelt, timing that was either coincidental or proof that Victoria understood exactly how screwed she was about to be. That afternoon brought the kind of coordination you'd expect from a military operation. If military operations involved environmental lawyers, forensic accountants, and very angry fish biologists, Sarah Morrison arrived with a legal brief thick enough to stop bullets, while Dr. Rodriguez brought real-time flood modeling data that painted a terrifying picture of what was coming. "Robert," Sarah said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "She's trying to tie up the legal system until after flood season. If she can get a restraining order keeping you away from the creek during the flood, there won't be any witnesses to document what happens to those homes." The Weather Service had upgraded to a flash flood warning. Snowpack in the high country was melting faster than anyone had predicted, and multiple storm systems were converging on Montana during the worst possible timing. Silver Creek was already running at 225% of normal flow, with peak conditions still days away. But Victoria had made one critical error in her final desperation play. The restraining order required her to appear in federal court and testify under oath about her claims, which meant she'd have to explain her surveillance accusations while prosecutors had recordings of her offering bribes and threatening witnesses. Agent Park from the FBI had been quietly building her case for weeks, following the money trail through Victoria's business network like a bloodhound with a federal badge. The embezzlement charges were solid. Nearly $250,000 stolen from homeowner assessments through fraudulent contracts and kickbacks. Add in the witness intimidation, the bribery attempts, and the environmental crimes, and Victoria was looking at serious federal prison time. The night before the hearing, I sat in my garage cleaning Great-Uncle's service revolver, not because I expected trouble, but because some rituals help you think clearly. The creek was roaring now, spring snowmelt turning the concrete channel into a high-pressure water cannon aimed at million-dollar foundations. Rebecca found me there at midnight, studying flood predictions by lamplight. Tomorrow changes everything, doesn't it? One way or another, I said, listening to water fighting against concrete constraints. Either the legal system works or physics teaches the lesson. The media attention had reached the kind of intensity usually reserved for political scandals or environmental disasters. Billings news stations were planning live coverage of both the court hearing and the flood conditions. Environmental law blogs had turned my case into a symbol of citizen activism against corporate-style HOA abuse. The hashtag #concrete versus nature was trending nationally. Jennifer had discovered that Victoria's family had already purchased a house in Arizona, proof of premeditated flight before the legal consequences hit. Bank records showed liquidated investments, closed accounts, and asset transfers designed to hide money from potential judgments. The woman was essentially fleeing the state while accusing me of being a terrorist. Harold stopped by that evening with intelligence from the final HOA board meeting. Only Victoria and one remaining ally had attended, while panicked homeowners demanded answers about flood insurance, legal liability, and foundation warranty claims. Several families had already filed suit against the HOA for unauthorized modifications that voided their coverage. "Robert," Harold said, "this woman, she has made herself enemy of everyone. Even people who voted for concrete project, they understand now she was lying to them." The irony was perfect. Victoria had spent months trying to turn the community against me, but her own greed and desperation had accomplished exactly the opposite. She'd isolated herself so completely that even her former allies were distancing themselves from the legal wreckage. Tomorrow, federal court would decide whether environmental law could protect citizens from HOA tyranny. But spring floods don't wait for legal decisions. Physics was about to render its own verdict on concrete versus nature, and physics, unlike Victoria, had never lost a case. The federal courthouse in Billings was packed tighter than a sardine can on April 22nd, with overflow crowds watching live streams in the lobby, while news crews fought for position outside. Judge Patricia Blackwood, a woman whose reputation for environmental law enforcement had made corporate lawyers break out in nervous sweats, presided over what local media had dubbed the Creek War Trial. Environmental groups filled half the gallery. Veterans organizations claimed another section, and local families who'd been fighting their own HOA battles occupied the rest. Outside, spring snowmelt was pushing Silver Creek to dangerous levels, while inside, Victoria Sterling was about to learn that karma comes with compound interest. Sarah Morrison's opening statement was surgical in its precision. "Your Honor, this case represents the systematic destruction of a century-old ecosystem to satisfy one woman's personal vendetta against a neighbor who wouldn't bow to her authority. The defendant didn't just violate environmental law, she embezzled nearly $250,000 from her own community to fund this destruction." Victoria's lawyer, a nervous-looking associate from Blackstone and Partners, tried to paint me as a radical environmentalist blocking legitimate development. His voice cracked when he claimed the concrete channeling was necessary flood control infrastructure approved by qualified contractors. Then Sarah played the recordings. The courthouse went dead silent as Victoria's voice filled the room, offering bribes and threatening Rebecca's career. You could hear gasps from the gallery when the secret HOA meeting recording revealed her true motivations: driving out incompatible residents to boost property values for her real estate business. "Your Honor," Sarah said, "the defendant's own words prove this was never about flood control. This was about using HOA authority to conduct ethnic and economic cleansing of longtime residents. My testimony was straightforward. 32 years of flood control experience explained in terms a jury could understand. I showed the judge great-uncle's 1976 engineering report, predicting exactly what would happen when concrete replaced natural flood absorption. Computer animations demonstrated how the channel directed 450% more water toward the HOA homes during peak flow conditions. But the real drama came when Dr. Rodriguez presented real-time flood monitoring data. Creek flow was approaching record levels while we sat in court, and the concrete channel was performing exactly as great-uncle had predicted, like a high-pressure fire hose aimed at million-dollar basements. "Your Honor," Dr. Rodriguez testified, "this concrete installation has created an imminent threat to public safety. During peak flood conditions, which we're experiencing right now, Water velocity in that channel will reach levels capable of undermining foundation stability.